Hi, welcome to theAnalysis.news. I'm Barry Stevens, and today I'm talking to Paul Jay, the senior editor and originator of The Analysis, about this crazy past year of 2025. In earlier parts, we talked about the US plan to dominate the Americas, and in the second, the ongoing war in Ukraine. And in this part, we're going to delve into the chaotic, jaw-dropping events in the United States in 2025. It's been 331 days since Trump was inaugurated, Paul. The Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, said to Mr. Trump that you are a transformative president. I think that's true. We've seen a style of insults and threats, of demonizing racist groups, soldiers moving into cities, masked paramilitaries snatching people off the streets. There was an early lurching attempt by Elon Musk to strip the public service, followed by a budget that massively increased the debt and, of course, spent way more on the military. Trump's dream of a golden dome to protect the United States, a boondoggle, no doubt, and a chaotic tariff regime that is damaging affordability, all against the background of a supine Congress and a Supreme Court that seems to do what the president wants. So it's very easy to get distracted by the latest post that President Trump delivers. But maybe there's some things that we should talk about that are a bit more fundamental than the latest news crisis. And that's what I want to ask you about. How do you see this structurally as a change, and what is happening underneath?
Well, I think we should take Donald Trump at his word. And the great enemy is domestic. And it's the socialists, it's the communists, and it's the radical left. And I think he's right. That is the enemy of the American elites. Why? Because capitalism, global monopoly capitalism, but especially American capitalism, is facing existential threats wherever it looks. Threats to what? Not threats to the American people. Threats to the United States as the global hegemon. But to the American elites, that's existential. It goes to their core, their identity, that they are, what one section sees them as liberal democracy and the model for that for the world, even though it's a complete delusion when you look at the history. Or it's being realistic that, capitalism is the best system there is, and especially if you're rich. And it's this kind of competition that drives it, and global competition is no different. And you want to win. And it comes from the DNA of the economics of it. I said this in one of our earlier interviews. It's not just some belief system or ideology, it's that the very fundamental fabric of how capitalism works is capital seeks monopoly. It doesn't seek a reasonable profit. It seeks maximum profit. How do you get maximum profit? You defeat your competition, either through being more efficient or through you have more power through the government and you get laws passed that benefit you and wipe out smaller competition. You control banks and finance and so on and so on. But the fundamental thing is capital seeks monopoly. So on a global scale, American capital seeks global monopoly as much as it can. And for quite a few years, it was pretty successful. From the end of the World War II, up until maybe, early 90s, fall of the Soviet Union. And then you get the rise of China, and now the game changes. So in terms of global control of the markets, cheap labor and raw materials, it's now in what they see as a life and death struggle with China. There's no reason why it has to be, but if you want to be in control of the world, that's how you see it. Number two, most of them know the climate crisis is real. Some may be in denial, but we know the fossil fuel companies know it's real because they sat on the research for years and hid it. And we know they know it's real and from all kinds of disclosed documentation. We
The
know the
insurance
insurance.
companies know it's real.
I was about to say the insurance companies know it's real. There's all kinds of properties they won't even insure anymore, and they're taking it into their algorithms, which means the banks know, finance knows. The problem here is it's not that they don't know it's real. It's they don't know what to do about it. Because to do something effective, there's only one way to go. And that's essentially nationalize the fossil fuel companies, phase them out, and use big public investment into sustainable energy and take the money away from the Pentagon to do it. It's dead simple. And there probably has to be a Manhattan Project for geoengineering. I know it's a dirty word amongst much of the climate activists, but I'm pretty persuaded that most of the scientists who are for phasing out fossil fuel quickly, urgently, they say it's too late to rely just on that. And I have to say, we're not even coming close to doing that. But even if you do that, you need some kind of geoengineering that gets carbon out of the air without destroying everything. But it can only be done through a publicly owned project, like a Manhattan Project. But the objective isn't profit making. The actual objective is solving the problem of the climate crisis. Well, that is a pretty radical transformation of the economics and politics of the United States. And the elites, the conscious ones, I mean, probably the majority of millionaires and even billionaires, they maybe haven't thought any of this through. They just look at how much money am I going to make today and tomorrow, and how big's my yacht, whatever. But the think tanks and the more conscious sections, more class conscious sections of the billionaire class, they know it's real. But they're not willing to do what it takes to do something about it, because it's too radical a transformation of who has power and what the economy looks like. And they'd rather risk it. They think, well, you know what? I got money and I'll find a way to, we'll be okay. Yeah, millions of people will die. Maybe whole countries like Bangladesh will disappear, but who cares about Bangladesh anyway? They haven't cared at all about the millions and millions of children that starve to death every day. I mean, or I should say every year, if you're talking in the millions. Even though they brag about how, poverty has gone down globally, but they don't want to tell you most of that is because of what happened, the reforms in China. So they know the climate crisis is existential, but they won't do anything about it. They won't even pay lip service. So they'd rather have a climate denier in power than actually have to, have, like, the problem with Biden administration. They did pass some legislation that at least had a little bit of scale, that had some effectiveness at refurbishing buildings, promoting electric cars, some, reducing coal. There was at least something there. It wasn't near enough to really deal with the urgency. But once you are doing something about it, even if it's not enough, it means you're recognizing the problem is real. And that's going to encourage people to think this thing through. And when you think it through, capitalism as we know it can't deal with it, which means you need more public ownership, at the very least in the energy sector. And they being the corporate elites that are conscious of this stuff, they hate the concept of doing anything that encourages anything that looks socialistic. Like, they won't go for Medicare for all, even though it exists in every industrialized country in the world, and some that aren't that industrialized. And even though it's clearly an effective use of resources, they are so bound by don't open the door even a crack to anything that looks socialistic, because people are going to say, well, maybe the socialism ain't so bad. Now we're seeing the Cold War identity is weakening, breaking down. You can get a Mamdani elected in New York City without an out socialist labeling and identification. I mean, his policies are not threatening private property. If they're really fully socialist, I mean, he is talking about publicly owned grocery stores. So there's a beginning of something there. And I'm not critiquing Mamdani in the slightest. Given the conditions, I don't know that you can do more than that. And it is an opening. And the right, of the majority of the right, which includes the corporate Democrats, they don't even want an opening, which is why it's so ironic. On the day Mamdani and Trump meet, and Trump goes la, la, la with Mamdani, the House passes a resolution against socialism, which includes the majority of the Democrats, which is just beyond
That's
nuts.
theater.
It's not entirely theater. It's theater, but it's theater because they want to make sure the elites know, the funders of their party know, we're not socialists. We aren't going to actually challenge how stuff is owned in the United States and how wealth is distributed.
But wait a second. I mean, you said that Biden, with his Green New Deal and so forth, spent a great deal of money and had positive direction in terms of reforming the energy system. Well, why couldn't we have a more rational government that is looking forward to solving this problem, and with the market and private ownership filling in and accepting that leadership? And like, for instance, somebody who makes windmills or solar panels in a private capitalist system would make money.
Well, clearly those divisions in the elites do exist, and clearly there are companies that are making.
Why do you have to have
money.
public ownership for it to happen?
Well, not entirely. It doesn't absolutely have to be public ownership. There may be ways, but we haven't seen it. It's kind of ironic that the state that has the most windmills and solar is Texas, more than California. Mm-hmm. So the problem is that the underlying ownership, structural ownership of fossil fuel, of the military industrial complex, of everything, is more concentrated in the financial banking sector than it ever has been. And it greatly increased after 07, 08 with the big asset management funds, BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, which own, between the 3-4 of those asset management companies, they own close to 10 to 15% of everything on the stock market. There are many, many conflicting interests. But so far, at least, after the Biden kind of experimentation with dealing with climate, the preponderance of the elites have moved over to, let's deny it's happening. Like, where are even the Jamie Dimons of this world? Where are they? They used to talk about it. Larry Fink, head of BlackRock, about 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, early in the Biden administration, he actually started a whole thing how BlackRock wouldn't invest in coal anymore, and they were going to start to phase out, and they were getting pressure from the younger generation of wealth that's inheriting money, to do something about climate. There was a year or two there, where the media was full of climate this, climate that, where it's urgent, we got to do something. Now you got the worst flooding ever, and nobody on television wants to tie it to the climate crisis. You have the worst fires ever, and nobody wants to tie it to the climate crisis. It's the odd minor voice gets on TV. At least till now, they have chosen denial. And I think, I can't prove it. I don't have a document, but it seems like obvious. They think the transformation needed to be effective is too much, and they'd rather take the consequences. I have actually heard interviews with people from Wall Street who say it openly. It was interesting. They were AI entrepreneurs, big brain AI guys, investors and scientists, saying the real threat is AI. And somebody said, well, what about climate? That's what the interviewer said. And they said, yeah, climate's a great threat. And we are going to lose, millions of people are going to die because of the climate crisis. But eventually we're going to figure out a technological solution. And eventually we'll solve the climate crisis. In other words, humans can survive the climate crisis, they argued. We can't survive the existential threat of AI if AI takes over the world and gets rid of humans. So we better focus on AI.
The irony, of course, is that AI has been driving an enormous increase in the use of energy. And even though the energy system is way more efficient than it used to be, even though renewables have come online quite dramatically, it's still, our use of oil still continues to climb.
And the other irony is AI now, as it is now, could plan an economy to phase out fossil fuel and phase in sustainable energy, and do it in a way that's relatively decentralized, doesn't create some big centrally owned, state-owned thing. Anything too concentrated of ownership is dangerous politically in terms of democracy. But AI opens up so many solutions too, but not if it's all about for profit and militarized. So, but what I mean, there's much you can say about that conversation I'm talking about, but the main thing is they had concluded we will put up with climate crisis because sooner or later we'll solve it through geoengineering. There'll be a technological silver bullet. Yes, millions of people will die, but they won't say publicly, but they will say privately, I'm sure, well, millions of people are already dying, so what's a few more? As long as it ain't us, and that's what they figured. Okay, another one. So the system doesn't know how to deal with this. Let me go back to the issue of China. They have no solution for China. They don't know what to do. Right now they're trying to kick China out of Latin America. They're probably going to inflame a revolutionary movement in Latin America. In the final analysis, even if they go through a phase of some pro-American dictatorships, they're probably going to wind up with revolutions that bring in governments that want to work with China even more. But the underlying structural problem is they badly need the Chinese market, not just to produce stuff, but to buy stuff. And the same companies, the Palantirs and the Elon Musks and the Bezoses, I mean, you name it, are they going to give up on the largest market in the world after the U.S.? And it won't be long, the way things are going, before the Chinese market's more valuable than the American market.
But it's very difficult for these, honestly, very often poorly managed American firms to compete with Alibaba and the giants in China, who are much more successful.
Yes and no. I mean, China doesn't make very good commercial aircraft. They buy most of it. They were buying most of it from Boeing. But the more they threaten China, this is what's been happening. The more they put tariffs in China and export controls, then China says, okay, we'll put a whack of money and we'll make it ourselves. So they're actually pushing China into more a position where China can decouple more, even though the far right heritage and 2025 talk about decoupling. China's getting into a position where it's going to be easier to decouple. I don't think they really want it. They need the American market as much as the Americans want the Chinese market. The Chinese big advantage is still relatively cheap labor. It's still exports. The West, I covered a G20, God, it must be 20 years ago in Toronto, something like that. One of the big demands of the G20 was to China to start raising incomes more quickly so they had a stronger domestic market and weren't flooding the world with cheap products because it was too hard to compete with. And you can see it in electric vehicles. Canada won't allow Chinese EVs into Canada because Canadian slash American
because we were told not to by the United States.
Well, not only that, the Canadian auto industry can't compete with them.
Yeah,
for the same reasons.
A $50,000 car, a Chinese version will cost 20.
Yeah. But the point is the economic model of China, cheap labor / export economy. The West has been trying to get them to say, raise your wages, not because they give a shit about workers' wages, because they don't want to raise the wages here. They want the Chinese to raise the wages over there so that they can rely more on their domestic market and less on exports. But the Chinese, don't want to do that. Or if they do want to do it, they want to do it in their own pace, because right now they're doing well with this model. And when I say they, I mean, the Chinese billionaire class is doing very well with this model. And so are the more urbanized technocrats and professionals and so on, and to some sections of the working class. But other sections of the working class are producing stuff under such horrible conditions, they're committing suicide, jumping off the top of buildings, and they're
I think
being
that
prevented from
shifted.
unionizing.
I think that shifted quite a bit, but in the
No, it
last
hasn't. No,
10
it's
or
been
15
shifted a
years.
little, not quite a bit, a little. There's still
Mm,
there's still not any right to free and
that's true.
independent unions in China.
Yes, I meant the suicide.
They don't know how to deal with the crisis. They don't have a solution for China. They can't defeat China militarily, and they can't outcompete it, and they don't know what to do. So they're facing whether it's climate, and there's a third one. Let me just quickly say this one. The financial architecture of the world is a complete house of cards. The amount of money tied up in derivatives is something like 2 or 3 times global GDP. The amount of money tied up in currency swaps, the Bank for International Settlements put it at somewhere between 60 and $90 trillion off the books of the banks in currency swaps. I won't get into the details now. I did an interview about this a while back. If one of these banks goes into crisis and can't fulfill its side of the currency swap, it could start a domino effect that, according to the Bank for International Settlements, would create a crisis that would make '07, '08, I don't know if they're exact words, but look like a tea party. And what they did say explicitly is the Fed doesn't have the kind of money it would take to plug that hole. So financial architecture is a house of cards. They don't know what to do about climate, except denial. They have no idea what to do about the competition with China. And they know pandemics are coming again. And what that will do with the global supply chain again. They're facing in every direction existential threats. So why does that mean in domestic politics? You need something as authoritarian as you can get, as quickly as you can get. Get rid of this liberal democratic state. I'm talking as a large section of the elites, not all of them, but certainly the ones that are all around Trump. And there's been a shift in where the money is. And the money, there's another massive pool of wealth and capital, perhaps dominant in Silicon Valley tech, where the older money, whether it's Lockheed Martin and Northrop and so on, and the older banking capital, they don't have exactly the same interests. And the Trumpian cabal, Peter Thiel's and Karp's and others, they are ideologically in the Mussolini Hitler sphere. They're into metaphysics, Christian nationalism, extreme American nationalism. They openly talk. Karp from Palantir, the guy from Anduril, Peter Thiel, openly talk about the need for state organized violence. They use those terms openly, which connects with renaming Department of Defense, Department of War. At this time of existential threat to elite rule, to this American hegemony, they have authoritarianism, trend towards dictatorship, and war.
I mentioned earlier to you the Thucydides trap, which was a reference to ancient Greece. The historian Thucydides said that the cause of the war between Athens and Sparta was losing power to the rising power of Athens. Therefore, they became aggressive towards Athens. And that is being cited as the situation with China and the United States, where China is a rising power, and the United States is flailing because it is losing power, and that's when it becomes most dangerous.
I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. The reason they're going on, they being the Trumpians and a section of the Democratic Party against socialism, is because objectively, without any doubt, some form of public ownership and democracy is the only way out of this mess. It's obvious.
I would also say that another thing that is absolutely essential to get out of the mess is cooperation between the great powers. And right now they're all at each other's throats, which is extremely bad. I mean, the fact that Russia and the United States and China are all not cooperating in
Well,
any sphere that is important.
yeah, well, the same processes are going on in Russia and China, in specific ways. China doesn't have to be as aggressive internationally as the United States. They have a big market and they already have these commercial advantages and so on and so on. There's specificity why the United States is particularly malignant. But I want to reinforce this. The reason a Mamdani wins in New York is because ordinary people started to get, you know what, the Cold War stuff was bullshit. What he's saying makes sense. The same thing happened in Seattle. You had that woman that almost won in, where was it, Tennessee?
Tennessee.
The progressives are getting some traction. Sanders and AOC, when they went on the speaking tour in red states, got 30, 40, and 50,000 people out. There is, I think and I don't think this is new, I think the American elites have always been far more scared of the left of the United States than the left ever realized. Why did they go so after the left during the McCarthyite period? I mean, was the Hollywood tent such a threat that you had to go fire everybody? Yes, there were militants in the union, socialists and communists and all that.
But the power of ideas was, and the power of Hollywood, that was pretty significant.
It was something.
The power of a good story, the power of a good narrative.
Okay, but it wasn't a threat to their power. There was no political force. There was no. They got rid of Henry Wallace pretty easily. Well, I'm not disagreeing with you.
No, I know, I understand. I just wanted to.
Just the domestic threat of working class consciousness has been the great threat since the time of slavery. Of course, then it was slave consciousness, which is why it was illegal to teach slaves to read. A white person could be punished teaching a slave to read. Class consciousness in one form or the other has been the enemy, and it's again the enemy. And right now, the elites prefer the Trumpian authoritarian model. And we'll see, because I don't think Trump personally will last all that much longer. But
they're split. I mean, the right wing on the United States is not a monolith. They may accept Trump at the moment. And Trump, who of course was lifted to power through the dissatisfaction of a great many people with the elites who had been running in the United States up to then, both Republican and Democrat. And by the way, the thing you just referred to, the 40s, and the thing was so interesting in almost everything you've been saying is this focus on China. But the history of the United States elite was very much focused on Europe, the Atlanticists, you might call it, or the Council of Foreign Relations you referred to earlier. This has been a real change, that they're moving away from that idea that Europe and the United States, symbolized by NATO,
well, that's the Trumpians,
was going to continue.
It's not the whole shift. It's certainly not a foreign policy consensus to move away.
No, so there is a division going on.
Oh, big time! It's riddled with divisions. The foreign policy elite and the military industrial complex on the whole want all of the above. They want tension and potential war everywhere. They don't want to calm things down in Europe, but a section, want to focus on China, and they have their own interests, and the Silicon Valley guys seem on board with the focus on China. Maybe because who is the only real competitor to Silicon Valley? The Chinese. There's nobody else that's anywhere near AI development as much as China is. So if you're a Silicon Valley guy and you want to control AI of the world, your enemy's China, not Europe or Russia. They're nowhere near where China is. So yeah, it's riddled with contradictions and conflicts amongst the elites,
including the Christian nationalists and
yeah.
who have a slightly different view of the world. And people like, as you said, Peter Thiel, who would like to have their own island and their own state.
Yeah, but I want to just reinforce this one thing. Right now, the elites are terrified of the American people, and American people don't get the potential strength they have. And they always have been. I mean, the Americans have always been more scared of Americans than they are of anybody else because they knew the other threats weren't real. But they're really scared that the American people are going to wake up, and there are signs of it happening. And, you know, I was even Rand Paul. I was listening to him the other day. He has a solution for the healthcare problem. He wants to sell healthcare insurance through Amazon and Walmart and whatever, and have these insurance plans where anybody can buy in at a reasonable price because there'll be such a big group, they'll be able to force the price of health insurance down. And Rand Paul used the words, a cooperative, collective approach. Now that's right, that's socialist language from a libertarian capitalist. Why? Because it makes sense. That's why all sensible solutions lead to a collective cooperative solution. Everything leads to that, and that means it leads to real changes, at the very least changes, in the way property is owned and wealth is distributed in the United States. So American politics is in disarray because they don't know what to do about this, and this coming midterms is going to be fascinating. Because I think you're going to have more breakthroughs of progressive left candidates. And the weaker the corporate Democrats get, the more there's the possibility. Now, what might happen is the corporate Democrats may use various shenanigans, especially when it comes to who's going to be the next president. But even at all the levels, they might find ways to try to kick progressives down and not let them run and sabotage.
Have an Obama figure or somebody who's acceptable to who can say the right progressive things. But also, once Trump is a particularly, as Mark Carney said, a transformative president. He's a narcissistic man baby who is probably senile and unable to stick with any particular thought.
Yeah, but Trump as a person, he'll be gone soon.
And he may be gone sooner.
But what I'm getting at is something else.
2028.
I'm getting at something else. I'm getting at these parties may split. The Republican Party may split, and the Democratic Party might split. And frankly, if that happens, it will be I think a very good thing.
Because it won't be a good thing if just the Democrats split.
No, it won't be. No, it can't be just the Democrats unless there's a massive switch to a progressive position, and the split essentially marginalizes the corporate Democrats. And that means we're at a level, that means the mass movement has awakened in a way that will even surpass the 60s, which I wouldn't, if we get into real financial crisis again, and given what's going on with the financial economic architecture of the world, how vulnerable it is, it's not out of the question we're going to be looking at another 1930s. And in that kind of context, I don't see another New Deal figure in sight. So we'll see. But this disarray in American politics may have several next acts, including the splits of both major parties. But I agree with you. If the American sections of the American left think that can happen, until the Republicans split, that'll be a colossal mistake, because then we will end up with a full-fledged dictatorship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's Germany, 1930, 33.
Yeah, that is, yeah.
Yes, that's. But perhaps there is some hope in. I remember, I think it was Sanders and Paul co-authored a bill forcing the Pentagon to submit to an audit, which they never have. They never have.
Yeah.
And it didn't work for whatever reasons. But that libertarian, progressive unity, it might be a very interesting way forward.
There's
Because
Rand Paul.
a great many of the supporters of Trump, as we know, it's almost a cliche. I think even Trump has said it, that some of the people who vote for Bernie have also voted for Trump and the other way around
Yeah, but
because
you've
they're
seen it.
disruptive and they're dissatisfied
You've
with the
seen it
ways
on
they are.
Gaza. You've seen
Mm,
some of the libertarian right
yes,
ally with the left on Gaza. And
yes.
Rand Paul has taken some positions that allied with some of the left Democrats, including Bernie, on some of the foreign policy stuff. Yeah, it's possible.
Well, let's hope. I mean, there's maybe a good place to end on a note of hope that there's a possibility of those who support whose main value is freedom and liberty, and those who support the general well-being of all
Well, you're
might be
forcing
able to
me.
come together.
You're forcing me not to let it in. I don't buy that the Tucker Carlsons of this world, who have come out so strongly against Israel and AIPAC and such, and even though I fully agree with their denunciation of the Israeli state and AIPAC and such, they have very far right draconian ambitions. So there may be some very short term tactical things you could ally with, but I wouldn't create any illusions that they don't have the fundamental objectives of isolating China, of all of the Project 2025, all the heritage found, everything we've been talking about. They don't disagree with any of that. They just have a disagreement that they think Israel, the bottom line is they think Israel is a distraction from allying fully with the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emirates. They think they just give up on the bloody Israelis and just go all in on the Arab monarchies and get the Arab monarchies fully on board against China because they think
Mm.
America first. And they think that's what that means. I got to say one more thing. It's at a time when the ruling elites are in such disarray, we, the people, have the most opportunity to break through. We need to take advantage of this moment.
We the
I'm
people.
done.
Thank you. We've had this whole conversation, three parts. The first part about the United States' new direction to dominating the entire hemisphere, with the possibility of that becoming a war with China. We've talked about the war in Ukraine and Russia and Europe and how that worked. And we've talked about domestic US politics and the dissent and the splits and dissensions and hopes and fears. Well, one thing we've never mentioned in all of this is nuclear weapons. They underlie everything. They don't underlie everything, but they hang there, as John F. Kennedy said, like a sword of Damocles, waiting for that string to be cut. And I should repeat to the audience that you are making a film based on Dan Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine,
And
called
you're
How to
and
Stop
you're
a Nuclear
working
War.
with me. So.
And I am actually the co-writer, full disclosure. Okay. See you next time. There's a donate button. Subscribe.